We have two presenters. Actually, Professor Zhao Suisheng is teaching in the United States, so overseas Chinese perspective on China's power. Professor Chen Zhimin is teaching at Fudan University, Chinese power assessed from a Chinese perspective who is living in China. So I don't know whether they were converging or diverging, but we'll see. And then we have two discussants, Professor Kang and Professor Go. Professor Kang will comment on Professor Zhao's paper, and Professor Go will comment on Professor Chen's paper. Okay, so Suisheng.
Okay, thank you. And at the last panel, the jet lag comes up. I don't know if I can still sitting here until the end of the panel if I fall into sleep. And the assignment for me is to examine Chinese power from the Chinese perspective. As Jia Ho mentioned that I'm now in the U.S., although I came originally from China, but I cannot be so confident to say I can present Chinese view like Professor Chen Zhimin could. Anything he says represents Chinese view. What I can do is to
Mix the Chinese American.
The Chinese American, not even Chinese American view, Chinese American perception of the Chinese perception. In other words, try to find the Chinese publications, Chinese government statements to see how their views are. In that context, what I try to do are several things. One is to look at the Chinese assessments of their own power. For these assessments come from two levels. One level at the popular level, the popular societal level. In fact, mostly from the popular nationalist perspective. The other level is the government level, those really in power, making policies. If those two views very often are in divergence, but some other times are convergence. So I want to see what time they are in divergence and what time they are in convergence. Another third measurement, if we can use that term, is to look at the China policy itself, because China's foreign policy policy actions reflect their assessment of their power. Because Chinese leaders are realists, very often they are making their foreign policy decisions are based upon their assessment of their power, or their power position in the distribution of power in the international system. So in that context, using those measurements, I divide China's perspectives into three periods over the 30 or 35 years that Zhou Hao has assigned. The first period, and also the three periods, I try to use three key words. The first period is after the end of the Cold War up to the financial crisis of 2008-2009. And the second period is starting from the financial crisis up to maybe next couple of years or up to now. The third period is from up to now, from now up to next 10 years. For the three periods, I use three key words. The first period is China sees itself as a developing country. The second period, the key word, China sees itself as rising power, or even great power, even sometimes inflated great power. So that's the second period. The third period, they have to come to reality. China is fragile, rising power. The China rise could be derailed, and China is facing a lot of challenges to become a real great power. So these three periods. Let's briefly discuss the three periods. The first period, China perceived itself as a developing country after the end of Cold War, because at that time, China was in a very, very, very vulnerable position. They found that all those allies are gone. China became a lonely communist country, facing sanctions from the Western countries, and also they thought their economic, military, and diplomatic leverage, everything were not that great. So in that context, both at the societal level and the governmental level have tried to follow Deng Xiaoping's guidance, that is 韬光养晦, to keep a no profile, to keep their head low, and try to concentrate only on their domestic, they call comprehensive national strength building, 综合国力建设. On the foreign policy front, they try to use foreign policy to serve the domestic economic construction, 外交服务于国力建设. In the foreign policy action front, in both Asia Pacific and relationships with major powers, they have tried to build very cooperative relationships. In the Asian Pacific, they try to have, they call charm offensive, good neighboring policy, try to change their 以苏划线, 以美划线, 不以意识形态论亲疏, all those kind of new policies came out to reflect, they try to make friends, try to keep their head low, try to work with their neighbors. So that was a very conservative foreign policy orientation. At that time, they settled border disputes with Russia. In fact, they gave up a lot during that process. Also negotiated with Vietnam on the land border front. In the relationship with the United States, they try to learning to live with the hegemon. That's an article title published in my journal by Jia Qingguo. I really like that title, Learning to Live with the hegemon, because they did not like the hegemon, but they knew they were not in the position to challenge the hegemon. Although they talk about multipolar world, but they try to follow the policy. There was a unipolar moment. They have to live with that. And they try to not to be the second Mr. No, to follow the Soviet Union to exhaust itself. Jiang Zemin talk about 增加信任, 减少麻烦, 加强合作, 不搞对抗 in the relationship with the United States. And on all those events, in response to the Western sanctions, the bombing of the Chinese embassy, mid-air collision, all those kind of events, China tried to 大事化小, 小事化了, very, very low-key, very, very non-confrontational. All those reflect their assessment of their weak power position. In the mid-1990s, things began to change. China's perspective of power started to change, but that change reflects first on the rise of popular nationalist sentiments, which basically held inflated, I say, perception of Chinese rising power, and tried to advocate China to stand up to Western powers. All those China Say No books were a very good reflection. But the official level at this time tried to distinguish themselves from those societal popularist views. And they see nationalism as a double-edged sword and try to use it and control it. And that reflected China's reaction to the embassy bombing and to the anti-Japanese demonstration in 2005. I mean, you name it, before 2008, 2009. That was so kind of good old days of the Chinese foreign policy, reflecting their realist, pragmatic understanding of their position in the international system. Continue emphasizing the identity of a developing country at that time. They try to avoid the pretense of the big power. And there are so many examples when I did my research looking at the Chinese publications, even Wen Jiabao, when they ask about, I mean, in Europe, talking about, he used the term 大国, translated into great power. Then Xinhua's news agencies changed right away into, oh, 大国 means great country, not great power. So they tried to avoid even the G2, all those concepts Wen Jiabao emphasized, those not right. China is still developing country. And many actions, they also emphasized China's peaceful rise in a harmonious world. 全心全意谋发展, 一心一意搞建设, everything reflected their understanding of their perception. So that's the first stage developing country. This perception began to change and inflated the change because of the financial crisis in 2009. During that period, the first reflection of this change of view, again, from societal level, from those popular nationalist publications, internet postings, and now have some military officers which are not in the policy-making circle talking about China's strong position or China's core national interests, all those very, very hawkish views. Basically here, they look at China's power now is in a position already to confront the United States, to take what they call 主导, to have a dominant position in the Asia-Pacific. And this is our backyard. So that is what we should do at this point. So this change was so clearly reflected, start from the popular level. But what is interesting during this period was the state and the policymakers began to become increasingly sympathetic to those views. Xi Jinping, ever since he came to power, a lot of his speeches, a lot of his statements and government policies also reflected that type of sympathetic views. No longer still talk about China's peaceful rise, peaceful development. Here, the China dream. The China dream is a very, very undefined concept. How do you interpret that? There are many different ways. The popular nationalists, Liu Minfu, these people can say, he borrowed that from me, my book, China Dream, 中国梦, it's mine. So it's a... But they may talk different things. But the rhetorics now from the state level and the societal level, there's a convergence. So clearly you see that type of, when Xi Jinping, when he was in Mexico a couple of years ago talking about those well-fed Westerners had nothing to do pointing finger in China. That time I tried to look at those citations, I could not find it anywhere because they deleted it at that time. Now they are in People's Daily, editorial. The identical, those kind of words came out. So, and the Chinese government became more and more willing to display their military. I mean, here we had a panel earlier about the military power. What I look at that the first one was the level anniversary in the April 2009, in 60th anniversary of the founding of PLA Navy. They invited all those embassy people. That was the first time. It's a big deal. Then the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic. Then you see from there on, in the conflict with Vietnam, with Japan, they had all those exercises, showed all their equipments, which in the past they did not even want to do. And Taoguang Hui is no longer talked about. Now you look at the current, the National People's Congress and the Party's Congress. I just got those kind of papers. They kind of keywords: 奋发有为，与时俱进，更加主动，主动进取，中国方案，中国身影。All those keywords. That's what in the People's Daily. I tried to look at, and also those articles. Those kind of keywords. I did not pick those keywords. Those keywords were picked up by those reporters in the Chinese newspapers. They said Wang Yi's speeches so clearly said 积极进取, not only 主动进取, proactive, and not even 主动. All those terms you can see in the Chinese official publications. And China also for the first time officially recognized China as a great power in the context of proposing to the United States building a new model of great power relationship. New model of great power relationship. Although they say new model of major power relationship, but in Chinese does not make difference. It's great power. it's great power. So, and China's relationships with major powers and with neighbors also changed dramatically. No longer try to build friendly relationships with all the neighbors. Now they are selectively building friendships with neighbors, but their relationship with the United States also changed. So this is a second period. The last period is, in the next 10 years, I would say China still have to come back to reality. They are facing challenges both externally and internally. Externally, China cannot be a dominant hegemonic power in Asia Pacific. They are facing a lot of challenges earlier panels talked about. And internally, they are facing so many domestic problems, corruption and economic slowdown, all those things. Even there are some kind of 新左派. What I want to cite is a Panwei's article, 中华不自乱，无人能乱华. If China does not clap itself, nobody can clap China. So China enemy is not the United States, it's not Vietnam, it's not Japan. China enemy is China. So that's the problem China has to face in the future. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. 15 minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to use a PowerPoint.
Oh, yes.
Hi, Jeho, and be here first time in the Asan Institute. As a Chinese living in mainland, so I'm very glad that you give China a voice at the end. I think that my talk would strictly follow Jeho's guideline. Maybe because we had a lot of discussion over very good wines in Seoul and also very good crabs in Shanghai with Shanghai, Chinese 黄酒, right? Jeho assigned two of us to do the same topic. I wrote, I don't know whether Sam, you write to Jeho about that. I said, whether you have a division of labor among us, otherwise we might write very identical papers, right? So I'm very glad that actually Jeho was very smart. And, Sam, you mostly focus on the conceptual part on the Chinese side about the Chinese power. And I mostly would focus on the quantitative assessment by the Chinese side about the Chinese power. So mostly three parts. First part is how the power is cultivated in the past. On the second part, we will look at how the Chinese assess the power gap with the United States. And the third part would have a projection, mostly by some of the Chinese colleagues, right? I think that when we look at how the Chinese power evolved, there might be like two main periods, right? First of all is like the Chinese power is mostly relying on its so-called geopolitical power. It's a power partly generated by its own strengths, but very much due to the so-called strategic triangle in the Cold War years between the United States and Soviet Union and China. So the Chinese, I put it as a swing power, right? By shifting sides from Russia and the United States, which give China a smaller power or with small capacity, actually can play a very important, sometimes crucial role in the Cold War years. But since the reform and opening up, I think that the Chinese start to feel that being just a geopolitical power is not enough, right? The Chinese realize that its own capacity is very limited, so it is, the focus is trying to develop its own capacities and very much start from the economic development and growth. maybe a further point I didn't discuss about that is that after Ukraine crisis, whether the Chinese become, or plus, the own capacities, whether we start to become another new swing power. No, that's just for some discussion. So I think from the late 1970s, the Chinese start to focus on very much on its own capacity, and after the end of the Cold War, and the own capacity is the only basis for the Chinese, because the bipolar world is gone, so the swinging, power is gone. So your influence, your power is mostly based on your own capacity. But how the Chinese develop its capacity, certainly they start with economy. So I think economic development is the first priority since late 1970s. And all this reform and opening up and participating in the global markets and all sort of these efforts. Because, like Deng Xiaoping said in the 1980s, that for China there are three main, objectives, right? In terms of our foreign policy, is opposing the hegemony in international affairs, national unification, and economic modernization, right? But he thinks that among the three, the core, the basis, is the economic modernization. So the focus is very clear that all the efforts will be concentrated to develop the Chinese economy first, right? And certainly that was very successful, and now the Chinese already has a GDP only secondary to the United States if we didn't take the European Union as a whole, right? Nationally, second largest economy, the biggest trading state, foreign currency reserves, you could name that a number of indicators certainly put China at number 2 or somehow, economically speaking. The morning session, the first session, afternoon session, we have colleagues discuss the Chinese military power development. I didn't put a lot of figures in tables in the paper, because I assume that our colleagues working on the various aspects of the Chinese military power would include some of the tables that. But generally, I see that there are three, a period there. David, you start your defense budget tables from 1988, right? So we have a very early period, I think, when China started to reform, opening up, and then to 1987, we have seen a tremendous underinvestment in the military because of all the resources we devoted into the economic development. The military budget increased, but the growth rate, is smaller even than the inflation rate, right? So a huge, in real value, that the military was very much underinvested that period. So from 88 to 97, we see, I categorize it as a catch-up defense investment, right? So they keep the pace with the growth rate of the GDP and also the growth rate of the state budget, right? So, but actually they cannot make up the previous underinvestment. But then from 1998, we might see that a real, we call them make-up investment, right? So the growth of the military expenditure is faster than the annual growth rate of the GDP and also the government expenditure. So now we see a surge in the Chinese military defense spending, which I think certainly helped that the Chinese can have money to import military technologies or weapon systems from Russia and sometimes from Israel, maybe some dual-use parts from the Europe, some other places, Ukraine, right? So now we have some imported good stuff, but also the Chinese indigenous defense industry has been developing very fast. Okay. Yeah, that's some of the figures. But still, it's only 1.3 or 1.5% of the GDP. I should do quicker. And then the reason focus on soft power. I just want to skip it, right? So the important part, the second part, is how the Chinese compare Chinese power with the United States. I look at several assessments. I think that the Chinese has a fascination with this topic. There's a number of projects has been produced assessment on so-called comprehensive national power, 综合国力, right? Although their definition is quite different, right? So that here is one. They look at the 4 categories and look at all these major countries, how they figure, right? So there is another one done by the Chinese Academy of Science in 2003. So they look at all these 16, possibly 13 countries and how Chinese figure, right? Here's a summary of the main projects, their results, right? So basically here we look at how much the Chinese CNP as a percentage of the United States, and how China is ranked among all the countries they studied, right? So in the 1990, I think they already said that it would be almost half of the United States, but China just ranked 9th or 10th. Moving forward, we see that they feel like the Chinese CNP is improving in terms of a percentage of the United States, and its ranking is improving, right? But interesting, this one is the last one, as far as I notice, that in 2010, right, they conducted by scholars from the Chinese Academy of Social Science, and was quite controversial, as I recall, that because they think the Chinese CNP in around that time is still 7th. Canada was ranking 3rd or 4th, right? And they ranked Chinese military force power at the 2nd, only after the United States. And the military officers was very mad with them. I see how you can just counting the numbers of the tanks or the number of the army force to or the budget, and then you put China at number 2, because modern warfare needs lots of high-tech things, right? And this quality of weapon system is much lag behind in China. So on either side, either people say that you put China too powerful, or the others say that you put China too weak, right? So after that, nobody has done that work. But I think maybe it's time for us to redo some kind of a assessment, because quite some years passed. Projection. A few observations out of that. I think that there is a great eagerness in China trying to find that the relative power between China and other countries, to find your place in international system or power hierarchy to inform the Chinese foreign policy. And also, if you look at the categories, aspects of a power they were assessing, you find that include more and more like new elements, like scientific power, ecological power, information power, governance quality, social development level. So all these things, they were included in the CMPs, and which I think the governments will also be pushed to focus to develop these new aspect of national power. Yeah. Projection very quickly. Give me 2 minutes, right? I would say that in the past assessment of the Chinese, I think were very conservative. They usually underestimate the growth of Chinese power. There are several reasons, right? As I indicated here. Nobody really predicted China would surpass Japan in GDP by 2010. But in terms of a future projection, the past over-conservatism may lead to over-optimism in these two cases, like the two books by Huang Gang, The Common Prosperity, China in 2030, and then the Yan Xuetong, The Initial History. He was projecting the Chinese power by the year of 2023. Right. So basically, they were looking at the Chinese power will grow, although with a little slower pace, but still will grow very fast. Currency continue to appreciate, but this year I think Yan Xuetong has to think about, because in the first quarter the Chinese currency was devalued of about 2.6%, wipe out all the appreciation the currency did last year. Yes. So, yeah. So what about the future, right? By 2025, 2030, I think that their views might be a little over optimistic, but if we become more like reduce our estimation, but still we'll see like 10 years later or longer, there is a very powerful China there, right? So whether we are seeing that a G2 world by 2025, what about European Union? If they are really not becoming a unified force, that the European countries may sideline. What about the rest of the world? So I think a lot of questions. I'm particularly interested in this part. The few Chinese really have that projection in the future, but I think we need to really think about that. Thank you very much. Sorry for.
Thank you, two presenters. Now, designated discussants. David, you go first.
Okay.
10 minutes each.
Yes. Okay, I'll be quick. In these ways, I think in some ways these two papers are potentially the most interesting. And so my comments are aimed at trying to help make them obviously better, but to fit in also with the rest of the chapters, because I would love to see these two papers, speaking more broadly, sort of speak to the other chapters that we've had from the outside looking at Chinese power, right? Particularly, like, for example, Sean's paper or any of ours, particularly, how do the Chinese view, how would you assess how Chinese view discursive power, et cetera, right? And I think that'll be clear in a minute as I go through these comments. But I think it's going to also, you have a key decision to make, which is this going to be your assessment of Chinese power, or are you going to really show perceptions how Chinese, speaking for 1.3 billion people, right, how they view themselves? And I think that's a key decision to make. And I think sometimes in the paper, the chapter, it goes back and forth between here's how Chinese view it, here's what I think. And I think to make it really fit in, you can do either one. I mean, I'd sort of lean towards getting the Chinese perspective, right? But it's easy to sort of go back and forth. For example, because you end up concluding defensive realism, et cetera, right? Is that what they're using, et cetera? So let me make a couple quick comments that I think would be fascinating. You can choose to listen to them or not. even though you're supposed to talk about the elite and the people, the focus on the popular perceptions was pretty thin. But I would love to see a more thorough discussion of how Chinese people view themselves, right? I mean, all these papers, every year, what does China want? Everybody wants to know. And I think you could really make really add a lot. Because, for example, simply talking about nationalism, I'd love to see you interrogate it more. Is this brittle, defensive nationalism, insecure, or is it proud, increasingly proud, self-confident nationalism? What does that mean, right? I mean, if it's sort of defensive realism, et cetera, that still strikes, but is it changing? I mean, and let me give you a couple examples of things that I think are fascinating that might just came to my mind, right? Living in LA, I'm sure we all know, there's a fair amount of capital flight as, Chinese come over and buy houses with cash, right? It's an ocean of Chinese buying houses in LA. Clearly, they're trying to get their money out. I mean, is there any way you could measure this, get us a handle on it? All we know is we just sort of read the newspaper articles, right? But how much do Chinese elites who have or rich, not the elites, but who have the capability to leave, how much do they leave? I mean, do you have any idea? Do you have any numbers, right? Brain drain. We certainly know they're all studying in the United States, and we could fill our entire MA with Chinese students from Chinese universities, right? Is there a brain drain? Is there not? Are they going back? I'd love to see how you can see what Chinese are choosing to do. And I'm sure you guys all know about that online Chinese poll about if your child was born on the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which nationality would you choose? They did it twice. It's online, but they did it in China. And so in PRC, 40% of respondents said they would choose Taiwanese nationality. 25% chose Hong Kong nationality. 20% chose Japanese nationality. And only 15% chose PRC. Right? And they did it a second time, a big furor. I'm sure you guys heard about it, right? It's just anecdotal. But it shows the Chinese people, if you ask them, do you hate Japan? Of course, everyone will say yes. But if you ask them how they view their own, who knows the real problems in China better than the people living there, right? And there's a fair amount of evidence that they know that there's a lot of problems, which would lead to a different view of what it means to be nationalist, or how they view their own power, or they're probably very proud. I'd love to see you interrogate it more. They're probably proud of what China's done. They also know all the problems. So I'd love to see you really get into how Chinese people view it themselves from the bottom up, right? From the sort of top down, I'd love to see some reference to the Ian Johnston piece. What's new and assertive about China's new assertiveness? He makes the argument that essentially there's not that much new or assertive, right? Which would sort of go counter to the narrative even that's in these papers that China's getting bigger, I'd love to see you in conversation with that kind of stuff. I'd love to see what Chinese, or again, depending how you choose it, but certainly what Chinese would explain. Do they view themselves as being more assertive in South China Seas? Or what is the explanation for it, right? Are they viewing Japanese actions as having forced them to respond? I mean, that's what I'd like to see. Because certainly that's not the view that we have, but I'd love to see how the Chinese view, or the ADIZ, right? Is it, what is the explanation you would see that they see? Are they really just feeling more confident? Or is it finally, is there some kind of defensive reaction to it, right? And that way we'd really get a sense of how Chinese themselves are viewing their power. And lastly, to go back to the chapter speaking to each other, again, I'm giving you a lot, but you pick and choose, right? A lot of these phrases that came up in the earlier papers, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, is there a Beijing consensus, right? China didn't come up with that phrase. People use it outside, right? In terms of these ways of Chinese viewing themselves and their values and what they stand for, that would speak directly to Sean's paper and probably a lot of others, right? Can you find an emerging view? We are going to have these alternative ideas, right? We have a vision for the future. Or is it simply, well, we're a lot more powerful now. What are we going to do with it? I'd love to see some discussion of that, that would speak directly to the other papers. But I thought it was really, really fascinating, so it sparked a lot of comments. Okay, Evelyn?
Thank you. I was asked to comment on Chen Zhimin's paper, and Zhimin, it's a great paper, and very rich, with a lot of detail in it. And Zhimin's made the choice, I think, to reflect more the state of the debate within China than more your view. I think you're on that side of the divide that Dave's talked about. And I guess for that reason, it was extremely rich. And I, as I read it, naughtily gave Zhimin's paper alternative headlines for each of his sections. And, you know, he starts by sort of briefly reviewing China's sort of positional, pivotal kind of power during the Cold War. And it's a very useful section to sort of set the context. I just wondered whether for that period you might have slightly underplayed, you know, China's ideological power in that period, and the way in which it used sort of the ideological element to project, particularly into the so-called third world at that time. I mean, many of us tend to think that China's engagement in Asia, Latin America, etc., is new. It's not new. You know, it does stem at least from the Cold War period. So I just felt that your focus on geopolitics very strongly, while correct for this period, maybe did underplay some of the sort of ideological elements. But that's just a minor thing. Then Zhimin, in his contemporary section, has a section, you know, that I have sort of called Softly, Softly. And he didn't have time to talk about this in his presentation, but he talks about soft power and, you know, the range of sort of studies, you know, within China and outside, trying to get to grips, you know, with the question of whether China has any soft power and, you know, in what form and how quickly this may be, China may be amassing these resources. And I suppose, you know, I am a skeptic of soft power as a conceptual tool for the very simple reason that I can't see the connection very clearly between attractiveness and strategic or foreign policy outcomes. So, you know, again, on the American analogy, just because lots of people drink Coke, wear jeans, and watch Hollywood movies doesn't mean they're going to support you when you invade Iraq. So, you know, on the Chinese side, I wondered, given, you know, your survey of the sort of range of Chinese debates and perceptions, whether there is a distinction between, as you said, the idea of 软实力 and 软力量, or I'm trying to think what the other... yeah, perhaps 软权力, yeah, soft authority, yeah, or soft impact even is kind of where I was coming closer. So, you know, is there an idea that what do you do with this soft power or soft resources once you've amassed it? I wondered what, you know, whether there's any kind of thinking about that in the Chinese debates. And then that's followed by a fascinating section on which I have called "Oops, yours is bigger than mine." It's and this is something that Zhimin had time to talk about. You know, it's that obsession with, you know, working out China's comprehensive national power and where China ranks, right, in relation to everybody else on that. And a couple of things really stood out there. And Zhimin's already observed this. You know, a lot of this, of course, is based on quantifiable stuff. So it is based on material power. And the CAS 2010 report, which is the one you sort of, you know, detail in quite a lot, with quite a lot of detail, is the one that, you know, really highlights, for me anyway, you know, this idea that we've had, Dave, that the world is hierarchical. It is full of unequal, you know, resources and unequal authority relationships. And you know, it comes out very clearly in that kind of ranking in the different military realms. And I wondered whether you had any basis to make that connection between the, you know, the CAS finding and the sort of rhetoric, you know, in the sort of around 2010, 2011 of the 一超多强 kind of public official rhetoric that came out of China, and whether there was any connection between these findings and that sort of public acknowledgement that China is only one of a number of aspiring, you know, almost powers that still are not in the same category as the US, which still leads across the time period of your CNP studies that you cite. And the problem, of course, with these studies is two assumptions. The assumption that rank is in itself the most important thing, right? Second assumption is, of course, that quantifiable material variables are the things that are going to tell you the story. And I don't know, I was wondering what you thought. I mean, you know, you've very clearly and very interestingly reflected the debate, but there's not much of what you think in there. And I mean, just to provoke you, my sense is that if you add in the stuff that you say is missing, the social, stuff, the soft power stuff, the attractiveness stuff, the authority variables that Dave and I go on about sometimes, the gap is even wider for China, right? That's my view. I'm not sure if you would think the same. And then Jimin has the final section, which I have given the title, Just Wait, right? And this is the Yan Shetong and Huang Gang kind of projections. Just wait, we're going to hit that point, yeah. China's back coming, And again, it's a fascinating section, but I would really like to, thought it would be very helpful for the project too if we got a sense of what you thought, of these projections. And is it some sort of compensation that having underestimated China's trajectory for the last 2 decades, some, scholars, some with very realist persuasions that we well know, are overcompensating for that underestimation of the last 20 years. And what is the sort of wider reaction to Yan Shuitong's arguments, particularly within the Chinese elite, I suppose, and all Chinese scholars? That would be quite interesting to know. And just very, very finally, I suppose, the thing that stood out for me in both your papers was that at critical junctures, you really reflect that sense of frustration in at least the Chinese public reactions to these attempts to calculate comprehensive national power, to other sorts of instances where China's growing resources don't seem to yet be buying it the kind of impact that Chinese people feel that China ought now to have in the global, the regional order. And personally, that kind of frustration really worries me because, again, this is maybe the just wait argument for the realists coming through, that it seems to me that that kind of sense of frustration, victimization, the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance between this is what we ought to have, but why don't we have it, right? Is that sort of stuff that really underlines the dangerous period in a power transition, if we believe that we're living in a power transition, right? It's that status dissonance issue. And I wondered whether, for you, that there's any material that you would be able to push to make some comment on that. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you very much for excellent comments from both of you. I have one comment for both of you, Sui-Sheng and Zhimin, and this is also the puzzle that I have had for a long time. Right after the financial crisis erupted in '98 in East Asia, some Chinese scholars began to use the term 负责任的大国外交, responsible great power diplomacy. And then in 2000, Ye Zhicheng at Peking University wrote a very influential piece, 中国大国外交势在必行. In other words, it's high time for China to implement great power diplomacy. And then gradually that became sort of a popular word in Chinese writings. But Chinese government refrained from using the term, or when it has to use, they hasten to distinguish between 大国, a big country, versus 强国, a strong nation. But now, after 10 years since then, Chinese do not seem to really, take pains to distinguish between these 大国 and 强国. Now suddenly the 大国, the great power, the big power, tends to have this strength or strong power meaning in it. So it is an interesting change. At the same time, it reflects some sort of confidence on the part of Chinese. If you look at the Wang Yi's statement on March 18th this year, I was surprised by the frequency at which the term 主 was used. 主动进取 was used twice. He also used the term 主场, which is actually, China should use China as a main venue for diplomacy. Not the US or not other Western countries, but China should be the main venue for global diplomacy. He also used other 主权 and others. But in other words, so China actually wants to be a more proactive, more forwarding approach compared to the past. But at the same time, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is still very sort of modest. In other words, when they translate the term used by Xi Jinping, the 新兴大国关系, they first posted major power relations, new model of major power relations, and after a few weeks, they changed it to major country relations. Although you use a different term in your paper, but officially they still use major country. They don't use great power. Okay, so they are very modest. So what I'm trying to get at, or hopefully what I'm asking you to address in your paper is this really a genuine modesty on the part of Chinese, or is it sort of a calculated modesty on the part of Chinese? Or what is your take on this? Because I think a lot of people will be curious to know where China really stands as far as this issue is concerned. For instance, Xi Jinping in his meeting with Obama in Annenberg, he said this: the Pacific Ocean is big enough for both China and the United States. But actually, he mentioned that in a very, very favorable context, because there is an old saying in China that is, 一山不容二虎, two tigers cannot coexist in one mountain. So actually, Xi Jinping is rebutting that phrase, therefore creating a room for coexistence between US and China. But on the other hand, it also reflects a situation where Chinese leader has said, we want to share the control over Pacific with the US for the first time. No foreign leader has ever said that since 1945. So, I mean, a lot of people, just like myself, are agonized over where the balance should be between, the sort of modest, calculated modesty on one hand and the genuine modesty. So I hope you can address this in your response. And I think David's recommendation for chapters speaking to each other is an excellent one. Particularly, two chapters by you should do that. You refer to, Francois' chapter and the Sean's chapters and so on. Okay? Now, response. Jimin first. 5 minutes, Rich.
5 minutes, okay. Yeah, it's great because certainly that is a draft paper. So basically, I look at the others, how they assess the Chinese power. Because 1 year ago, I did an article about how to see the power in the Chinese, the role in Chinese foreign policy. But it's more like a theoretical to reconceptualize the concept of power, and then we look at in a qualitative way to see the Chinese power. So I still have a problem trying to add my part because they are talking about very quantitative things, right? So if I have another concept, but you don't have a quantitative result, so it's I'm still thinking, and particularly also about the projection. It's very difficult to do because you need a lot of many aspects and a lot of work have to do. So I think that we try to add some of my viewpoints, in the final version, but maybe not my own quantitative assessment. Maybe later on we could do that. I see that it's very interesting work. The soft power part, because I have, in the previous article, we talk about, we try to, when we talk about power, we look at 3 dimensions, like what kind of power resources you have. If we are talking about non-material power resources, what the Chinese have, and then how they use it. On that part, I think I differ with Joseph and I, because non-material power resource could be used attractively, like I now talk about, but also can be used in we call coercively, naming and shaming, all these kind of things could be categorized in that as direction. So if there, and then what is the purpose, right? The purpose is try to change the other people's behavior according to my will, or is try to defend yourself, not being changed by the others, right? So in that part, I think soft power is, I don't see that the Chinese soft power is very high. I see that a lot of shortcomings there, but still, for the people in China and also in the government, they would think efforts to promote Chinese soft power is still very important in the sense that they could, have defensive, discursive defensive power, which would, particularly in facing the coercive soft power from the Western world, right? So not necessarily try to shape the others in the Chinese version. I think the assessment certainly could be related to the Chinese concept of 一超多强, one superpower, multiple major powers. But I would say that maybe in the past few years, the sentiment in China might be changing because of the sense that the Chinese might, become, the second, right, 老二, right? So maybe still below the United States, but they would surpass many others. Particularly those realists like Yan Xuntong, they don't think the European Union is something. Although I feel that we still need to take European Union as a group of states still seriously, right? But anyway, there is a sentiment that China is becoming stronger among the secondary, powers. Right? That relates to what Jeho talked about. Is that from a big state in the sense of big size, big scale, towards a big state emphasizing the strengths, a strong state. So now I think the government is talking about 大国外交. That is real, doing diplomacy like a big power or big country or a strong country. Right? But still, why they still try to avoid the use of power? Because as what I mentioned in the first session, that when we talk about soft power, the Chinese try to focus on 软实力, right? Soft capacities, not about power, because power means control of the others. And you want to talk about major power, and it looks like you want to control the others. So they might still prefer like state, more like a neutral, which can gives you more like interpretation, like in the direction of the defense, right? Way. That might be too much already. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I think your comments are really right to the points. One is the Chinese possession versus my own comments. I think that's what I really should, in this paper, should be more consistent. I try to present Chinese views, but very often I just, that's not right. So that's consistency. The second point, even better, I like it. The elite views versus the popular. When I talk popular, still I talk about the elite. Here, those people talk about the Diaoyu Island birth. I did not heard that story, in fact, but that makes sense. I believe in that story because I saw a lot of.
It doesn't surprise you. Yeah.
I will not surprised. I will not be surprised by these kind of things. So there is something somehow different from the rhetorics what we have read from official and elite level. In fact, that reinforces my third part. Basically, although Chinese government talked all those things, they are not really reflects the reality. Here, part of the reality is that their own people don't believe in their own, power or their own future. That's those numbers would be really interesting. Chinese buying houses. I don't know if that numbers are available.
Yeah, I don't either, but it'd be
and
great to see.
Yeah, brand type of things should be really those if I have those data would really aid a lot to give a more complete picture of the Chinese perception of their power. In fact, here I even can say there is no Chinese view of their power. There are different people's view of the Chinese power. The state leaders, those kind of elite, those people, and also those, even among these, maybe what they say is not different. Is different from what in their heart. A lot of people still want to put their money outside of China, but still they say, oh, we are so big in China, so good in China. So we see those kind of inconsistency there. So about Joe Haas, the point about China talking to 负责任大国, I think here there's an issue. They have a different audience. The Chinese, they use the Chinese language for the Chinese audience. When translate those into English, they have a totally different audience. The 外交部 Foreign Ministry, what they talk about that, they have the mind of in the U.S., in their neighboring countries. So different audience they have different targets. So that might be the case here. But overall, I think they become, at least at elite level, become more and more, I would say, inflated assessment, but they are become more and more confident in their power at that level, and it's rhetoric.
Thank you very much. I would like to use about 10 minutes time for floor discussion. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes, Yoji.
Just quickly, I think the difference between Hu Jintao leadership and Xi Jinping leadership in terms of ground national strategy is that under Hu Jintao is really prosperous economy and powerful military. Under Xi Jinping, one thing is added, that's a great power status, that is official.
Okay. Any comments or questions? Okay, okay. Kevin?
Okay, thanks. In the previous panels, we've heard many definitions, Western definitions of power. In your studies, have you come across Chinese definitions of power or a concept of power? And if you have, would that somehow maybe give us a little bit more insight into how Chinese view power and actually carry out power?
CMP. Any more questions? Yes. Could you identify yourself first?
Yes, Stefan Bo from Seoul Village. I had a question because you raised the question of ideology and say it's nationalism, but it's also a trend of materialism in China and the projection of China's perception of at the individual level, and so it's about the depth of the projection. Economic projection at the individual level, is it sustainable and the way it is perceived? Well, I don't know if it's...
Okay. Is there any other question? If not, I will get back to our speakers.
Yeah, I think that it's, if we are talking about power, right? The concept is, generally speaking, there are consensus around the world that your ability to let others to do what you want them to do, right? And I was saying that you can use material resources to let them do, or you could use non-material resources and by attraction to let them do. So what we are trying to look at is that, you try to redefine something, right, about the objectives, right? What the purpose of the power. So I think that maybe for the Chinese, if you want China to be a normal power, act like other great powers, then definitely they they would like to use the normal conventional concept. Professor Yan certainly would love to adopt that kind of concept, right? But I think for some other Chinese colleagues, I think I am one of them, is that we think that if China wants to become another great power, that should be in a different, somewhat different way. So you do not use your power so quickly, to your own objective, interest. You may emphasize more on the attractive side. So, yeah, and the purpose not to impose your wills on the others, right? And somehow people might say that the Chinese, like a Taoist tradition, that sometimes you refrain from doing something might end up being a good thing. If you look at the Ukraine crisis, is that maybe countries involved, they did too much, which end up being a mess. So I think, yes, with the Chinese historical, thinking, sometimes even if you have power, refraining from doing something may actually serve our own interest and maybe also the interest of others. So that might be something we can feel interesting new ideas from China. Thank you very much.
China's, I think their power for many years emphasized only on the military aspect, just like Japan and other Asian powers. Then they came in to emphasize economic power. Then eventually come to so-called comprehensive power. In fact, the comprehensive power, 综合国力, that concept came from Japan. The Chinese learned from the Japan. Then they became emphasized that the just met up soft hard power. China has been followed really quickly also. So China, I think, pretty much have been following the Japan and the Western concept of power. That's my understanding of that. I think Yuji's point is also very well taken there, for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone is hungry and exhausted. I am. My battery is about to run out in 2 minutes. So I'll use those 2 minutes to just conclude. I think our papers seem to suggest, with the exception of one or two sectors, China is telescoping the process of its rise within a relatively short period of time compared to many of its predecessors in the 20th century. Has been faster in pace, far-fetching in its implications, and more comprehensive in its scope. And also, one aspect that came out, at least to me, is that there seem to be some variations across different issue areas. And that is probably one thing that I'll probably bring out in my chapter 1. And many of the paper presenters came to the conclusion that the future is still very uncertain. And I think that is a good news for China specialists. That still gives an extension of our mission. But basically, by 2025, many people suggest China is still a partial power. China will be still rising. China is probably fragile. I would like to hear from Tony Saichi about this. And overall balance of power is still shifting. So uncertainty is probably the issue. Then the question is whether, should I just write down uncertainty is the theme? That I cannot do that. So somehow I have to come up with certain persuasive logic, but then how I can avoid this half full, half empty glass analogy. So that's the big homework for me. So with that note, I would like to adjourn this seminar. I would like to thank the Asan Institute once again and the staff members of the Asan Institute, particularly Zhu Yongzheng was indispensable, as well as Kim Jin-hee at the Seoul National University's U.S.-China Relations Center. Thank you very much for coming.